In Grand Lake and leader of his party.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to discuss the budget which has been revealed, and there's no question that not just New Brunswick but really across the globe there is some significant economic challenges because of the pandemic that we're still facing. The first item that I guess I would like to dive into is health care. And of course, as we look today, the Minister of Health is going to be touring the province and is in the process of doing that now to consult with the public as it relates to health care. And when you talk about health care, I mean, health care is a major part of the budget. When you have a budget of $10 billion, it's, like having a large family and a small pie, and it's how do you divide that up to ensure everybody gets something. But the issue with the budget here, of course, is that items like health care, DTI, and education take a big chunk of that $10 billion. One part of the budget that really I haven't heard too much talk about, but I do find quite exciting, is the advanced care paramedics. And I remember several years ago talking about how New Brunswick was the only jurisdiction in North America, even including Mexico, that did not have advanced care paramedics. And I've referred to them in the past as emergency rooms on wheels. And while our primary care paramedics do a fantastic job, because of government policy in the past, even if you are a licensed advanced care paramedic, you cannot practice to your full scope of your license because of what I always found unreasonable regulations around their ability to do what they are trained and the experts that they are in those advanced procedures. And that's important, because your emergency services are critical. I mean, I can't think of anything worse than being in a car accident or being in some sort of incident and having procedures that could be performed at that site before you get to the emergency room, but in the past they were unable to perform those procedures, life-saving techniques, because advanced care paramedics were not allowed to operate in their full scope of practice. So that is certainly one good piece of the budget that I know many people are not talking about, but will affect frontline delivery of emergency services. And $1.6 million allocated to that, I am hopeful, will allow each and every advanced care paramedic in this province to really be able to practice their expertise. The additional $7 million for mental health and addiction. While it's good, and while it is an increase, my concern is that it only takes a small part of an ever-growing problem. New Brunswick, as many other jurisdictions around the world, are trying to grapple with mental health and addiction problems. And $7 million, again, although good, quite frankly, isn't enough to address the massive problem that we have in New Brunswick. When we look specifically to youth mental health and the tragedy of Lexi Dakin and others, and I've spoke to counselors in schools who have told me that, when a youth or a teenager in the school is exhibiting mental health problems, it's a roll of the dice to take them to the emergency room as to whether they'll be seen or not seen. And that's unacceptable. It's unacceptable that anybody, especially a minor, would have to sit in an emergency room for hours on end asking for help and be turned away with a referral down the road. I see a $30 million increase to nurse practitioners. Again, another needed component to health care. There's no secret that New Brunswick, like many other places, face the growing struggle to recruit doctors here at home. As a result of the lack of physicians that we have in New Brunswick, there has to be some stopgap measures to ensure that people without a family doctor and those that need medical attention can get it in a reasonable fashion. And I think the $30 million, if allocated properly, can help with some of those wait times and help those with medical issues get the help that they need. In the grand scheme of the healthcare budget and the healthcare consultations and all the issues surrounding that file, one component that worries me is but a footnote to the healthcare reform is virtual care. It's disappointing that in this day and age that the Department of Health and the Minister doesn't see the vision and the potential for virtual care here in New Brunswick. Now, when I bring this up, especially to some people that question virtual care, it's not to be naive to say that virtual care is going to solve all of our healthcare problems, or that every ailment and every issue that you have medically can be solved through virtual care. Of course not. But virtual care can play a very significant component to medical issues that are not emergencies. When you think about hospitals, hospitals have an emergency department. And we've lost sight of what it means to be an emergency department. Departments, emergency rooms, have become what really should be a doctor's office. You know, people go there because they don't have a doctor. They show up at ERs because they can't find medical attention that they need. And again, this is an element that virtual care, I believe, can help alleviate some of the wait list and the wait times in emergency rooms and help those 70,000 New Brunswickers that do not have a family physician. In the budget speech, the minister states that over 85% of doctors' appointments went virtually during the pandemic. So you would think that if that model is working during the pandemic, if you're seeing an 85% increase to doctor's appointments virtually, and I might add that patient surveys show that it's in the 90 percentile range of satisfaction, so patients are happy with the service of virtual care. Doctors are using virtual care, were using virtual care during the pandemic at a rate of about 85%. But yet, rather than government expanding on that program and ensuring that virtual care goes to more hospitals and clinics and that virtual care expands to more of the population, instead, they cut the billing fees for doctors who are working in virtual care. So now doctors are paid one fee for in-person visits, and they're getting about half of that amount to do virtual. What do you think physicians are going to do? I mean, you know, there has to be some incentive and there has to be some funding and rational thinking to say, if this program is good, if this model works, let's expand it, let's not cut it. And if we talk about nurse practitioners, it is my understanding that nurse practitioners can be funded by Medicare through in-person visits, but nurse practitioners are not funded through virtual care at all. That's another issue that I don't understand. If you think about it, Mr. Speaker, especially as it relates to mental health, we know there's not enough psychiatrists in New Brunswick. We know there is a huge gaping hole when it comes to healthcare professionals overall, but in terms of mental health, psychiatrists, psychologists, those that are trained to treat significant mental health issues, they're just not here. But the question is raised by me that if you don't have enough of them here in New Brunswick, or they're located in a certain geography, the ones that are here, why could we not expand the virtual care model, especially in emergency rooms and local health clinics, to allow those psychiatrists that are either off duty or have some extra hours during the week to schedule them in to help with the backlog of mental health patients? And I mean, most mental health issues, I think, would be properly diagnosed through that method and through that system. Backlogs, wait times, and increased costs are all part of the healthcare system today, and I am convinced that a virtual care model would help alleviate much of that. Like most people, I would dare say, in New Brunswick, we all have our medical ailments from time to time, but, you talk about prescriptions. And there was a story this morning on CBC in relation to fax machines in the healthcare system. And, it blows my mind that here today, in this modern age that we live in, we've as a global community, we've put a rover on Mars, and yet here in New Brunswick, we're still using fax machines. And we were joking earlier, I mean no disrespect by this, but I would maybe let the minister know by sending her a page, and she can grab a quarter and go to a payphone and give me a call. I mean, that's the same type of mentality where we're stuck in 1960. We have advancement in technology, and we have digital opportunities to move into the modern age, to ensure that nobody's using fax machines anymore, that we have other means to ensure that prescriptions can be filled, that testing due to COVID can be done more efficiently and effectively than fax machines. But I'm concerned that this is a highlight of the problem in healthcare, is that we are archaic. We have got to get out of this mode of thinking. And to give credit to the Minister of Health and to the government, I am hopeful that through these consultations, that's the direction they're moving towards. And when we talk about My Health NB and eHealth NB and virtual care, all of these things combined, if properly funded and if the vision is there by government, we can see these things move into the 21st century. And the thinking behind that is, if you use modern technology for minor ailments, I mean, you ask most people, if I said to you, you have a minor ailment or you need a prescription refill, you have two options. You can go wait at the emergency room because you don't have a family doctor, maybe 7, 8, 10 hours to get your prescription refilled, or you can go in your bedroom, log on to a site, have a doctor there in front of you, get your prescriptions filled through that program, and go about your day. I can guarantee you 100% of people would say, I'll take the virtual care model, which makes more sense. Which means, in turn, your emergency rooms have less people flooding the halls for minor ailments and can actually perform as an emergency room in emergency situations. So I want to encourage and I want to urge the government and the Minister of Health to take into consideration a stronger approach to these digital technologies that are available to us today and that have proved effective, not just here in New Brunswick with the 85% and the 90% plus success rate and patient satisfaction, but all over the world. I mean, there's ERs across North America, and many American hospitals are using virtual care models that are working exceptionally well. Nursing homes. Health care and senior care go hand in hand. And when you look at the fact that of every 10 beds that are occupied in the province of New Brunswick, 10 hospital beds that are occupied in the province of New Brunswick, 3 of them are seniors. They're not sick per se, they do not need acute care, but government has nowhere else to put them, they have nowhere else to go, and they languish in a hospital bed year after year. 30%, Mr. Speaker, of our hospitals are filled with seniors who do not need to be there. And what a quality of life for these folks. Think about it. They've spent their whole life working, contributing to society, being a part of New Brunswick and paying taxes and everything that goes with it, only to be in their latter years because the system is failing them to be in a hospital when they should be in a nursing home. The government's allocation of $10.3 million for the operation of 3 new nursing homes is indeed a good move. I think also there needs to be significant measures done in terms of how we move seniors out of hospital beds. And I remember when the pandemic struck last year, how quickly government moved to ensure these seniors did not stay in hospitals because they were worried about COVID infiltrating the hospitals, and moved them out of the hospitals very quickly, very efficiently. And I thought to myself, this could be a change maker moving forward. But unfortunately, we've reverted back to our old ways, where that doesn't seem to be happening as much as it did when the pandemic first started. The Auditor General, in her most recent report, recommended that the Department of Social Development evaluate the economic benefit of both for-profit versus the traditional model, which should include comparison of cost and quality of service. And I want to stress to government and to the minister responsible to look at that, especially considering the $10.3 million that's going to be allocated. I would like to know as a taxpayer, for every dollar I spend to nursing care, what is given first and foremost to the senior that needs it, and second to me as a taxpayer who's paying for it. How much does it cost? Is for-profit a better deal than not-for-profit or the traditional model? But more importantly, quality of service. How well is the for-profit looking after our seniors versus the traditional model? The Auditor General raised a very good point. I'll tell you, the Auditor General, Kim Adair McPherson, has done an exceptional service to the taxpayers of this province over her tenure here. I think Nova Scotia is going to benefit greatly by having her as their Auditor General, and she has pointed that out, along with many, many other things, that there should be a comparison between which model works. That makes sense, and that's exactly why I put the motion in to urge government to complete that comparison. I was pleased to see $12.4 million increase for home support workers, community resident workers, special care home workers, and family support workers. You know, I remember years ago when my wife did the duty of a home support worker in the Grand Lake area. And back then, you know, the pay was just above minimum wage. Be lucky if you got 20 hours a week, traveling, you know, all over the region, from home to home, cooking meals, cleaning homes, just giving that extra hand to seniors that they needed. And there's no question, I've talked to the organizations that head up these special home support work groups, and they've told me throughout the years, there's no way you can retain employees with these wages, with these hours, and with the travel associated with it and the work involved. They couldn't retain employees. They certainly couldn't recruit employees. I mean, we have made gains and advancements for home support workers, and I am optimistic that this increase in budget for home support workers and others will help with that recruitment and to retain those that are currently in the job. In relation to education, you know, you look at daycares. The standards for daycare operators and employees have dramatically increased over the years, and that's not a bad thing. As a parent of 3 kids, I want to know if I'm taking my child to a daycare that there's certain regulation standards in place that gives me the assurity of knowing my child is safe while they're there. The problem over the years is the standards have gone up, but the wages have not gone up to match those standards. And whenever more is required on someone, especially in a certain field, the wage has to match the standards and the increased regulations that go along with it. I think of the importance of daycares in our communities. If you don't have daycares, then it's really hard to have an active workforce. A small community of Chipman, in my riding, has no daycares. And the closest community of Minto, next door, is about a 25-minute drive, has a few daycares. But you know, I've talked to the mayor of Chipman, I've talked to business owners in Chipman, the Grand Lake Timber, the mill, which is the largest employer in the region, and they all tell me the same thing. We're trying to recruit workers. You know, people are willing to come, but they won't come, A, if they don't have a place to live, which is a huge issue in this province, and B, if they can't get their children in a daycare. So the increase for daycare employees is a positive thing. It's a positive step that I do believe will help with recruitment and retention And it will also hopefully incentivize others in places like small communities like Chipman to be able to have daycares be built to accommodate the growing need. Another part of the speech from the budget was in relation to agriculture. You know, I remember when the pandemic first hit, and I thought to myself, everybody's eyes should be opened around supply chains in the global markets. You remember the craziness of toilet paper when the pandemic first hit? I mean, it made no sense. Forget about everything else, but for some reason there was this mob mentality that all of a sudden toilet paper is going to be non-existent, and they rushed and they bought it and cleaned the shelves off. The problem is, when you look at something like food, what happens if that same incident takes place? And we saw, even with food during this pandemic early on, and we're still seeing repercussions of it today, that a little disconnection in the supply chain can throw off the whole global market. And I mean, let's be honest. If you can't buy a TV or you can't buy a certain piece of furniture due to global interruptions in production and shipping, life will go on. Nobody's life's going to be greatly impacted by not having that new flat screen. However, if you can't buy decent foods, fruits and vegetables, because of that disruption in a supply chain, that is a totally different thing. That can put our communities and our province in a crisis to our local population. Now, there's certain things New Brunswick where we all know we'll never run out of. I don't believe we're ever going to run out of potatoes here in New Brunswick. Apples, blueberries, maple syrup. You know, there's certain commodities that we produce here that I believe are here, they're staples, and they're doing well. But we have got to be able to expand beyond just what we have here and ensure that there's a certain level of security for our local province and our local people. I believe it's imperative that we invest in ourselves, provide greater incentives and assistance to achieve an expanding and self-sustaining agriculture sector. Again, in my own riding of Fredericton Grand Lake, I remember as a kid driving down through Majorville and Sheffield, and there was, many farms that seemed to be thriving and growing and flourishing, and now, I mean, they are still there, some of them, but you can definitely see a decline over the years because New Brunswick has not kept up with the agriculture sector to ensure that food is available to our areas. And of course, we have hard winters. It might take some ingenuity to ensure year-round greenhouses are able to function and thrive. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Other cold climate countries like ours have developed advanced technologies in greenhouses to ensure that there's year-round supply of food. But it is something we've got to take serious. It's something government has to look into and ensure that that the future is secure when it comes to local food. Broadband and IT. You know, another thing that COVID has taught us is the importance of online connectivity. Many private sector businesses, Crown corporations, and government departments have all gone to the decision to work from home. Platforms like Zoom and Microsoft Teams have come to realize the value of reliable internet connections. And for any of you that have done these Zoom meetings or Microsoft Team meetings, if you don't have a good connection, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It breaks in and out, and that's been one of the debate even with this legislature. You know, we talk about hybrid models and virtual legislature. Well, what happens if you're in a part of the province that you don't have good broadband? It has, significant implications. I remember years ago when Wi-Fi was entering the stage here in New Brunswick, and it was the newest thing in terms of technology. I remember how the city of Fredericton jumped on very quickly and very early, offering free citywide Wi-Fi to residents and visitors alike. And I remember how it grabbed headlines, saying here's a city in the middle of New Brunswick, the capital, that is innovative, that is moving in the right direction, is jumping on this opportunity, and they did. And we have to have the same mindset moving forward. We have to realize that we are in a new age, and we have to use the technologies that we have to ensure that access is given in so many ways, whether it's work, private sector work, government departments, healthcare, you name it. Affordable housing is a huge issue today. Finding a decent place to live in New Brunswick is a challenge. If you're a newcomer coming to this province or someone looking to buy or rent, your options are very limited, especially during a hot real estate market like the one that we're seeing here today. If you're fortunate enough to obtain an apartment, your rental fees are not as nice as they should be. You're paying more for rent, frankly, than what you should be. And the lower you get on that income scale of household income, the greater the problem is magnified because of the housing issues in New Brunswick. The $10.8 million investment in this budget in affordable housing, in my honest opinion, is a short-term Band-Aid at best. It's not going to solve the long-term problem of affordable housing, especially for low-income citizens. Only a vibrant and competitive private sector can create a market that balances supply and demand. But the reality is, New Brunswick will never have that vibrant and competitive market when government charges 182% more in property taxes than they charge in downtown Toronto and Vancouver. Vancouver's 111%. So just let that sink in for a minute. New Brunswick charges 182% more in property taxes anywhere in this province than downtown Toronto. And then we sit and wonder why developers are not building more buildings. And we sit and we scratch our head, well, why do we have this affordable housing crisis? And oh yes, we can take $10 million and we can throw it at the wall and hope that someone comes somewhere and builds us something and try to figure out some program, some government assistance. It's not going to fix the problem, Mr. Speaker. It's not a long-term solution. New Brunswick is the only province in the country to charge a double tax on non-owner occupied properties. The only province in the country. We're the only province that I'm aware of in North America that charges a double tax on non-owner occupied provinces. For example, according to the Apartment Owners Association, New Brunswick property tax rate is 189% higher than the other Atlantic provinces and 312% higher than the rest of Canada. We're not even competitive with Nova Scotia or PEI. We are so behind with this double tax that I was hoping that this progressive conservative government would actually implement a conservative idea, reduce taxes, and enable the private sector to balance the market in terms of affordable housing. And people say to me, the naysayers will say to me, yes, but if you eliminate the double tax, only the landlords will benefit. Well, I can tell you right now, the double tax that's being charged to developers and landlords, they're not absorbing those costs. What they're doing is they're taking the tax that they have to pay and they're making sure that that tax is on the bill of every rent you pay every single month. So inevitably, the tax that government charges developers and landlords is being charged directly to the tenants that are paying these ridiculously high rental fees in the province of New Brunswick. That is why I have been such a strong proponent that if you can reduce and eliminate the double tax, coupled with a legislative tax freeze that ensures rental rates will not go up for a period of time to allow the market to correct itself, to allow more developers to come in, actually have incentive to build here in New Brunswick, we would have a long-term fix to the issue of affordable housing here in New Brunswick. And it would also ensure that tenants see the benefit of the elimination of the double tax and not just landlords and developers. My friends to the left, they're to my right, but politically they're to my left. They talk about regulations around rent. And I say, you know what? I could support regulations around rent in terms of how much we increase rent and the regulations surrounding that if we get rid of the double tax. But the problem is, if you keep the double tax in place, and you put in regulations around rent, I guarantee you, you are going to exasperate the problem, because what is inevitably going to happen is developers and landlords that are in the business today, they're getting out, and anybody that was even remotely considering coming to New Brunswick to build, they're out as well. Why would anybody invest in a province that charges 312% more in property taxes? Why would anybody invest in a province that charges that amount of tax above and beyond other places in Canada? Oh, and by the way, we're also going to put more regulations so that you can't increase rent. You think you've got an affordable housing problem now? Just implement those regulations without an elimination of double tax and watch it explode. Mr. Speaker, while I firmly believe that in the midst of a pandemic and a global economic upheaval, now is not the time to balance books. I made that very clear time and time again, that now is the time that we have to look, and I'm not about just throwing money out for the sake of throwing money out, but we have to look at how can we support our province and ensure that the economy can rebound here in New Brunswick. But when I look at this upcoming budget, I have a great amount of understanding, and I think it is reasonable to have the deficit that we see in this budget. But what concerns me is when we look at year 2 and year 3. Next year, according to their own outlook, they're seeing a greater deficit next year than what we even have this year. And in year 3, it's going to be slightly decreased, but it's still a significant deficit in year 3. And I'm worried that the progressive Conservative government is becoming more progressive and a whole lot less conservative when it comes to fiscal matters. I mean, in many ways, when you look at strictly the 3-year fiscal outlook, I'm not sure if it's a Liberal budget or a PC budget. But again, understanding the first year, it's certainly reasonable. Mr. Speaker, we have to realize that we are in trying economic times, and fiscal prudency is going to be critical to our long-term survival. I got an email the other day from a constituent, and I used this example earlier in one of my response to the member statements. But she took a picture of her road. It was beat all to pieces, right? Potholes, I mean, you see it in the pictures. It was just atrocious. And she said, my property taxes have gone up significantly this year, and yet I'm driving on this. And she made the very down-to-earth question, where are my taxes going? And you know what the honest answer to that question is? Ma'am, your taxes and all of our taxes is going to the decisions of decades of Liberal and Conservative governments that have chosen to run deficits year after year after year, and today we are paying for that. So now our taxes are somewhere up here while our service delivery is down here, because we have to service the debt that previous governments have imposed upon us. And make no mistake about it, ladies and gentlemen, the decisions that governments make today in terms of deficits is going to affect all of our kids down the road when their service delivery is even worse than it is, and they're still paying ridiculous amount of taxes like we're paying today. Mr. Speaker, $658 million of the total budget is to service the debt. 6.6% of our budget was to service the debt. On a daily basis, Mr. Speaker, the province is paying $2 million per day to service the debt. So while all of my colleagues can laugh about deficits of past, we're paying for it today, and our kids will be paying for it down the road. That's why we must understand that balanced books is critical to the future of New Brunswick. But I agree, timing is everything, and that's why I agree that this current budget does seem to balance that reality. I believe every decision that is made by government fiscally has a long and a lasting impact. So if you ask the question, how do we get more revenue without raising taxes or without cutting services? Well, I think, Mr. Speaker, one part that we could look at that I do not see in the budget is in relation to the forest industry. I don't know if any of you have gone to a hardware store in the past couple months, but you'll see full well that the lumber industry, of all industries in this province and probably across the globe, is booming because of COVID and the pandemic. 2x4, which used to cost you $2 or $3, now is going to cost you $9 or $10. Chipboard, 2x6, name your product, you go and buy it, you are going to pay exceptionally more today than you would have even a year and a half ago. The problem is, and don't get me wrong, for the forest industry in New Brunswick, for the economy of New Brunswick, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's the thing that is keeping New Brunswick economy going to a certain level. But there has to be some balance there to ensure that this booming lumber industry, as we see in New Brunswick, that the royalty rates match the expansion and the sales of the lumber industry. It is by law that every year DNR is supposed to put out royalty rates, review them. Since 2015, that hasn't happened. Alberta, on the other hand, every single month, they're legislated to update their royalty rates. And Alberta, in the last 12 months, because of those monthly royalty rates updates, has seen a five-fold increase to their Crown Wood royalties in that province. If New Brunswick re-examined their royalty rates to ensure that a portion of the profit that the lumber industry is getting on the market comes back to the wood that's actually harvested on our land, let's not forget that. The wood in New Brunswick is Crown land. It's the people's wood. We need to benefit from that. And if we're not fairly benefiting from it, especially in an explosion of sales in the lumber market, that needs to be looked at, and that needs to be looked at quickly, because there is revenue that we're missing that can help New Brunswickers and help provide services to fill those potholes that I was talking about earlier. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, New Brunswick is not a self-sustaining province. New Brunswick's budget relies heavily on equalization payments from Ottawa. We all know that. What is somewhat scary, frankly, is that with this global downturn of the economy and the massive hit that the West is taking in Canada in relation to their fiscal challenges because of this pandemic, I'm worried that as time goes on, those equalization payments are going to become less and less and less, and that's less money we're going to have to put into hospitals. That's less money we're going to have to fix our roads and education. And that's why I've always said government needs to get out of all this other stuff and focus on what government was originally meant to do. Education, roads, healthcare, your infrastructure, you know, your basic necessities of what a government is meant to be and what it is meant to do. I want to encourage this government to review that three-year outlook plan. And again, while I look at the current year's budget, there are certainly parts of that I applaud. Certain parts I think are missing. Overall, I think it is a reasonable budget at face value. But the three-year plan does worry me. The three-year outlook does worry me. Because if we continue down this road of deficits, you know, down the road, we don't know if future governments can continue to run these deficits, and we can continue to put the bill to our kids and our grandkids. And what inevitably is going to happen when your taxes go up more and more and your service delivery goes down more and more, and all you're doing is you're paying to service a debt that your predecessors have imposed, unfortunately, people will leave New Brunswick down the road, and that's not good for future generations. So I want to thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to address this Assembly and those watching by home. And we'll certainly look into more of the budget as the week approaches. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.